Music, music. What began as a seemingly innocuous maneuver within the palace evolved within days into one of the quietest yet most impactful moments of power in recent monarchical history. A single piece of jewelry, deeply entrenched in the crown's possession, suddenly became the focus of a rumor that was taken far more seriously behind closed doors than it ever appeared to the outside world. The Jubilee brooch, closely associated with Queen Elizabeth's major anniversaries, became the catalyst for a decision that continues to raise questions about loyalty, succession, and quiet authority. While the public was still adjusting to the new order following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, processes were underway behind the scenes that rarely make headlines. In the secure areas of Buckingham Palace, far from cameras and ceremonies, the examination of objects began that possess not only material value but also symbolic power. During this period, Princess Anne emerged more prominently than ever. Not as an emotional daughter, but as a pragmatic guardian of an order she had known and defended for decades. The Jubilee brooch held a special place. It wasn't just one piece of jewelry among many, but a visual symbol of an entire reign. Whenever Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her major jubilees, this piece was present. It stood for constancy, for continuity, for a monarchy that survived change without losing its essence. Precisely for this reason, its future place suddenly became a delicate matter, as quiet expectations grew within the palace. Camilla, by then Queen Consort, expressed interest in the brooch. After years of public acceptance and the gradual consolidation of her role, the desire seemed understandable. But what at first glance appeared to be a natural continuation actually touched upon an invisible boundary. Not every possession of the crown automatically follows the current title. Some symbols obey a different logic. Princess Anne recognized this boundary immediately. For her, the brooch was not an accessory for the moment, but a sign of what was to come. In private circles, she had long been considered one of the last people Queen Elizabeth II trusted implicitly when it came to matters of tradition. Her assessments were rarely emotional, but all the more authoritative. This very attitude also shaped her view of the Jubilee brooch. The decision matured not in public discussions, but in quiet deliberation. Princess Anne knew that every movement of this piece of jewelry would be interpreted, whether intended or not. The brooch could signal closeness, but also the future. And in this case, the future meant not Camilla, but Catherine. As Princess of Wales, she visibly represented the next generation, the continuation of the line, not its current conclusion. Thus, a piece of jewelry became a statement, without announcement, without official declaration. The Jubilee brooch remained where Princess Anne saw it, on the path to the future of the crown. That this also meant a silent rejection of Camilla was well understood internally. But it was precisely this silence that made the decision unassailable. There was no open conflict, no headline, only a clear line. Within the palace, this realization spread quickly. Those familiar with the language of symbols knew what had happened. Princess Anne had not only decided on a jewel, but on the very narrative of the monarchy. Past, present, and future were rearranged without a single word leaking out. This marked the beginning of a development whose full implications would only become apparent later, for the question lingered. Was this decision an act of pure tradition or a deliberate signal about power and succession? And if a single piece of jewelry could have such an impact, what other quiet shifts were taking place unnoticed behind the scenes of the monarchy? The deeper one delves into the workings behind the palace walls, the clearer it becomes that Princess Anne was not simply reacting during those weeks, but leading the way. While many celebrated the transition following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, primarily through public ceremonies, the actual reorganization unfolded quietly. Where tradition is not explained but practiced, Princess Anne assumed a role that had been attributed to her for years, that of the uncompromising guardian of monarchical logic within the royal family. She was never considered sentimental. Her decisions were not based on sympathies but on stability. This very attitude also shaped her handling of the Jubilee brooch. For Princess Anne, it was clear from the beginning that this object could not be awarded according to personal preference. It wasn't about who would like to wear it, but about what it stood for. And this, what was inextricably linked to the long-term future of the monarchy. In internal discussions, it quickly became clear that there were differing opinions. Camilla had worked her way into her role over years, gained public acceptance, and demonstrated loyalty. Nevertheless, her position remained different from Catherine's. Camilla represented the present of the crown, Catherine, its future form. It was precisely at this point that Princess Anne drew the line. Symbols like the Jubilee brooch, she believed, belonged not to the moment, but to the future. This stance was not an act of affront, but a calculated act of order. Princess Anne knew that any symbolic ambiguity could create long-term uncertainty. In an institution that thrives on ritual, clear lines are crucial. The brooch, closely associated with Queen Elizabeth's jubilees, was, in her view, part of a legacy that had to be passed on, not backward, but forward. Her close relationship with Queen Elizabeth also played a central role. For decades, Princess Anne had observed how consciously her mother handled symbols. Nothing was left to chance, nothing sacrificed to the spirit of the times. Jewelry was never mere ornamentation, but part of a narrative. Princess Anne had internalized this lesson. In her understanding, the Jubilee brooch could only appear where it could continue this narrative. That Camilla's wish thus remained unfulfilled was not a sign of disrespect. Rather, it reflected a hierarchy that exists independently of personal relationships. Camilla acknowledged this reality without publicly questioning it. This very composure contributed to the fact that the decision did not generate any visible conflict. But behind the scenes, the message had been received. At the same time, attention increasingly turned to Catherine. Without her name being mentioned publicly, it was clear that the symbolic axis was shifting. Catherine represented continuity for decades, a role that was yet to unfold. By already mentally associating the brooch with this path, Princess Anne influenced the narrative of the coming years. Thus, a silent consensus solidified within the palace. The decision had been made long before it became visible. It followed no whim, no pressure, but a logic deeply rooted in monarchical tradition. Princess Anne had not spoken aloud, but her actions were unequivocal. At the end of this phase, a central question remained. If a single decision about a piece of jewelry already carried so much weight, what further signals would follow to solidify the future order of the monarchy? And how consciously does the public perceive these silent shifts? As the internal line became increasingly clear, Camilla inevitably moved to the center of the quiet debate. Her name didn't appear in official protocols, but everyone involved was aware of her role. As Queen Consort, she stood visibly at the side of King Charles II, firmly established and publicly accepted. Precisely for this reason, the question of the Jubilee brooch seemed explosive at first glance. But behind the scenes, it was understood less as a personal claim and more as a test case for the limits of symbolic power. Camilla had integrated herself into the structure of the monarchy over the years, accompanied by skepticism, later by recognition. Her demeanor was controlled, her understanding of her role clear. That she showed interest in the Jubilee brooch fit this image. The piece of jewelry was closely associated with Queen Elizabeth II, and wearing it in public could have been interpreted as a sign of respect and connection. But this is precisely where the uncertainty began, because respect alone was not enough to redefine the deeper meaning of this symbol. Princess Anne recognized early on that this question wasn't about entitlement, but about impact. In the logic of the monarchy, not every gesture is judged equally. Some have an internal impact, others an external one. The Jubilee brooch was one of those symbols interpreted in the long term. It wasn't an adornment for transitions, but for markers. Whoever wore it was automatically associated with the idea of permanence and continuity. In this context, Camilla's position was reassessed. She was part of the present, but not of the crown's long-term narrative. This distinction may seem harsh, but it follows a centuries-old order. The monarchy strictly differentiates between role and lineage. Camilla fulfilled her role visibly and loyally, but the line ran through Catherine. It was precisely there that Princess Anne made her decision. Remarkably, there was no open conflict. There were no public denials, no internal leaks, no demonstrative rejection. The rejection remained unspoken, but unambiguous. In palace circles, this very silence is considered the strongest signal. It showed that the decision was non-negotiable. Camilla accepted this reality without visible resistance, which in turn contributed to stability. At the same time, Catherine was increasingly perceived as a point of reference. Without any public spectacle, she symbolically moved closer to the center. Observers within the court registered this shift precisely. The Jubilee brooch acted like an invisible marker. It had not yet been presented, but its destiny was already becoming clear. Those who could read the signs knew that the course had been set. King Charles II assumed a mediating role during this phase. He left his sister's decision unchallenged and refrained from any public pronouncements. This behavior underscored Princess Anne's authority and simultaneously confirmed that the decision should not be interpreted as a personal rejection of Camilla. Rather, it was a structural arrangement that served the greater good. Thus, a new balance was created. Camilla remained recognized and present as queen consort. Catherine moved closer to the role she would one day fully assume, and Princess Anne enhanced her reputation as the figure who creates order behind the scenes before any ambiguity could arise. The Jubilee brooch was less an object than an instrument during this period. In the end, an open tension remained, not as conflict, but as anticipation. When would the decision become visible, and how would the public react when the symbol took its new place? These very questions began to circulate quietly but persistently through the monarchical landscape. To fully grasp the gravity of Princess Anne's decision, it is worth taking a close look at the Jubilee brooch itself. Its weight lies not in the material, but in the history it embodies. Hardly any other crown jewel is so closely linked to the defining moments of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. It was precisely this connection that made it a touchstone for power, continuity, and succession. The brooch was not created by chance. It was designed to mark a turning point, the silver jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II. In a period of political uncertainty and social upheaval, it stood for stability. When it was later expanded to commemorate the Golden Jubilee as well, its significance grew even further. It became the visible archive of a reign condensed into a single symbol. Whoever wore this symbol automatically assumed a connection to this long line. Within the royal collection, there are numerous jewels that are used flexibly. Tiaras replace brooches, jewelry rotates, and is adapted. The Jubilee brooch, however, operated outside this logic. It appeared rarely, but deliberately. Always when permanence was paramount, not representation. It was precisely this selectivity that diminished its power. It was not an everyday symbol, but a marker of historical continuity. Princess Anne instinctively understood this meaning. For her, it was clear that such an object should not be worn within the context of a current role, but rather in the context of a future responsibility. The brooch had to appear where it could forge a bridge between past and future. This consideration rendered any discussion of personal claim secondary. It was not about who was worthy, but about where the symbol should have its effect. From this perspective, Catherine became the logical wearer. Her position as Princess of Wales firmly anchored her in the future of the monarchy. Unlike Camilla, whose role was clearly defined, Catherine represented a transition that was not yet complete. It was precisely this openness that made her the ideal projection screen for a symbol like the Jubilee brooch. She could use it to refer not to the past, but to the future. This symbolic interpretation was not limited to the family. It was understood throughout the wider court. Historians, advisors, and longtime observers of the monarchy knew that jewelry in this context speaks a language that transcends words. The Jubilee brooch did not signal closeness, but direction, and this direction clearly pointed forward. The fact that Princess Anne protected this meaning for months without making it public further amplified its impact. The absence of an explanation forced interpretation. Every subsequent appearance of the brooch would automatically be read as confirmation of a previously made decision. This tension built slowly, fueled by expectations and quiet observations. At the same time, the particular power of restraint was evident. By not immediately passing the brooch on, its value remained intact. Its significance wasn't diminished by frequent use, but rather enhanced by its absence. This strategy perfectly aligned with the monarchical principle of creating meaning through scarcity. Princess Anne consistently implemented this principle. Thus, the Jubilee brooch transformed into a silent promise. It awaited the moment when its new role would become visible. And the longer that moment remained undecided, the greater the interest grew. Observers increasingly wondered when and where it would reappear, and above all, on whom. This inevitably elevated the decision to a new level. The question was no longer whether the brooch would be passed on, but how clearly its appearance would mark the future order of the monarchy. Would a single appearance suffice to anchor the message, or would several carefully chosen moments be needed to definitively confirm it? The moment Princess Anne's decision became visible was as controlled as it was inevitable. After months of quiet preparation, the Jubilee brooch emerged from obscurity for the first time, not in a private setting, not accompanied by explanations, but where symbols have their greatest impact, in the public sphere of the monarchy. When Catherine appeared at a high-profile engagement wearing the brooch, the message was clear, even without words. Observers reacted immediately. Within hours, it became evident that this was not a random choice of jewelry. The Jubilee brooch had not been seen elsewhere since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Its appearance on Catherine was therefore not a fashionable accent, but a deliberate placement. Those familiar with the language of the monarchy recognized it as a confirmation of the quiet line that Princess Anne had already established. The power of this moment lay in its quietness. There was no staging, no emphasis, no accompanying explanation. Therein lay its strength. Catherine wore the brooch naturally, not as an award, but as part of her role. In doing so, she made visible what had long been understood internally. The future of the crown had been taken over by a symbol that had previously been exclusively associated with Queen Elizabeth's reign. For Camilla, this appearance did not signify a public rejection, but rather a clear separation of roles. Her role remained untouched, her position stable. At the same time, it was unmistakable that certain symbols were not intended for her. This differentiation did not create division, but rather brought order. It clarified that within the monarchy, not every rank is communicated through the same symbols. King Charles II left the moment uncommented. This silence, too, was significant. It showed that his sister's decision was not being questioned. Rather, it fit seamlessly into the larger picture that prioritized stability over personal preferences. The family presented a united front, without any visible cracks. It was precisely this unity that amplified the power of the brooch. In the days that followed, there were further appearances in which Catherine wore the Jubilee brooch. Each one reinforced the new association. A single signal became a repeated confirmation. The brooch changed its status from a memento of the past to a symbol of the coming order. This transformation completed what Princess Anatalang had prepared. Within the court, the development was deemed a success. There had been neither resistance nor public irritation. Instead, a quiet understanding prevailed. Catherine was introduced to her future role not through words, but through symbols. The Jubilee brooch served as a visible link between the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II and the next generation. At the same time, the strategic depth of the decision was revealed. By not passing the brooch on immediately after the Queen's death, it retained its full significance. Its later appearance was therefore all the more powerful. Princess Anne had decided not only to whom the symbol would be bestowed, but also when it would take effect. Timing became the decisive factor. Thus, an internal deliberation became a public symbol that was achieved without conflict and yet drew clear lines. The monarchy demonstrated its continued ability to subtly communicate power and succession. The Jubilee brooch became proof that symbols often speak louder than words. At the end of this phase, a new certainty emerged. The future had received a visible sign without damaging the present. Yet the question remained, was this the final step in this quiet reorganization, or merely the prelude to further symbolic shifts yet to come? With the public appearance of the Jubilee brooch on Catherine, a development that had long unfolded in secret reached its visible climax. What initially seemed like an isolated event now revealed its full significance. The monarchy had sent a signal, quiet but unmistakable. Princess Anne had not only passed on a piece of jewelry but had set a course that extends far beyond the moment. Within the royal structures, this phase was perceived as the conclusion of a sensitive transition. The brooch had found its place, and with it, the relationship between past, present, and future was also redefined. Queen Elizabeth remained present as a benchmark, not through words but through a symbol that was now being passed on. Catherine thus embodied not only continuity but also the expectation of one day becoming a key figure in this order herself. Thus, Camilla remained part of this structure, but on a clearly defined level. Her role as queen consort was neither weakened nor questioned. Rather, the decision demonstrated that recognition does not necessarily equate to the same symbols. This differentiation had a stabilizing effect. It prevented competition and allowed for different forms of dignity within the family. Princess and emerged from this period with strengthened authority. Her actions reaffirmed her role as guardian of monarchical logic. Without a public declaration, without a visible claim to power, she had implemented a decision that is likely to stand the test of time. In an era when institutions are often under pressure from public opinion, she relied on the power of quiet order. King Charles II also benefited from this clarity. By not commenting on the process but allowing it to unfold, the crown presented a united front. The monarchy did not appear fragmented, but rather capable of action. This very unity is likely to strengthen trust in the long term, both within the family and in its public perception. The Jubilee brooch itself thus became a touchstone. She demonstrated how effectively symbols can be used when employed consciously and sparingly. Her transition from Queen Elizabeth II to Catherine was not a spontaneous act, but the result of strategic consideration. This strategy did not follow the spirit of the times, but a tradition designed to last. At the end of this development, one insight remains. The monarchy communicates its deepest decisions not through declarations, but through signs. Those who understand how to read these signs recognize early on where the structure is headed. The presentation of the Jubilee brooch was such a moment, calmly controlled yet decisive. This inevitably raises the question of which other symbols will be used similarly in the future. What silent decisions have already been made without becoming public? And how will this form of communication affect the perception of the monarchy in the coming years? The story of the Jubilee brooch shows how subtly, yet effectively, power is exercised within the monarchy. Beginning with the death of Queen Elizabeth, a period of reorganization commenced in which silent actions, not public pronouncements, set the tone. Princess Anne played a key role in this process. As a guardian of tradition, she made a decision based less on personal closeness than on long-term stability. Camilla's wish for the brooch was not openly rejected, but quietly accepted. Her role remained acknowledged, but certain symbols were deliberately placed outside this sphere. Catherine, on the other hand, was visibly thrust into the spotlight of the future by receiving the brooch. Without any theatricality, she was endowed with a symbol inextricably linked to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. This decision did not divide, but rather brought order. It created clarity without generating conflict. King Charles II deliberately allowed the process to unfold, thereby underscoring the unity of the family. The Jubilee brooch transformed from a memento of the past into a guiding light for the future. Ultimately, the realization is that the monarchy continues to rely on a language that transcends explanation. Symbols take on the role of messages. The presentation of the Jubilee brooch marks not only an end, but also a beginning. It demonstrates how tradition, power, and succession are quietly intertwined and controlled. And with a view to the